Sam is a professor and Alberta Innovates Health Solutions Scientist in the departments of cell biology and anatomy and physiology and pharmacology at the U of C. He's well known to you as the inaugural scientific director of the Hotchkiss Brain Institute. You're, I think, also aware of his major scientific discoveries. His glutamate receptor discovery and his stem cell discovery for which he received the Gairdner International Award in 2008. I've known Sam ever since he was in Calgary. He's an inspirational, dynamic leader. We couldn't think of anybody else better to actually be giving the opening address at this conference as somebody who's actually done it, taking science from the bench to the bedside. So it's my great honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Sam Weiss.
Thanks, Cy. Good morning, everybody. It's really a privilege to be here today. A couple of apologies ahead of time. I'm going to be talking about stuff that I've never talked about before in a public forum. I risk offending a number of people with some of my thoughts, particularly my basic science colleagues, so just bear with me because I think you'll see perhaps with time that my thoughts are not perhaps that far sort of out of the realm of possibilities. I too, I think, like Minister Horn and like Cy, I'm incredibly optimistic about the future. It's part of my, I guess, both a strength and a weakness for me. I'm sort of a ridiculous optimist. But I also believe that there are some challenges that we need to consider as we go forward. Mostly, the challenges when it comes to science is prioritizing what you can do your science on. And I will come back to that during my thoughts today. But I'm really going to talk about what I think is a new era, an exciting era for biology, and I call it human biology, and the opportunity, I think, to integrate what we discover in the laboratories with the health of populations. And I'm going to think broadly about populations not exclusive to our geographic jurisdiction, but on the international front, if you'd like. Okay. So I love showing this picture of Mount Lougheed because that's one of my favorite spots. It wasn't named after Premier Lougheed. It was actually named after, I think, his grandfather. But it's also, for me, it represents blue sky thinking, right? So that's why I'm showing this one. I'll come back with another picture towards the end where I do reference the Premier Lougheed. So the premise of what I'm going to talk about today is that we're in a new era now, really, very recently, that I think is going to transform what we do. There's never been a time, I think, that we are poised to study, to discover, create new knowledge around the human condition, around humans, than ever before. And this is accelerating daily. I'm also going to argue that we actually have a responsibility to serve when it comes to doing our research. We can no longer operate from the perspective that I'm only going to do what interests me. That's over. So we have to do more to solve human health needs. Again, I'm going to argue this is international in its scope. And I'm also going to be a proponent for the Campus Alberta concept because I'm doing that together with my colleagues from Lethbridge and Edmonton, approaching neuroscience from a provincial research perspective. Although I'm not going to really belabor that point today, but I'm going to tell you that it is going to be an imperative for us going forward. So I was asked to talk about the push versus the pull. And the first comment I made, I think, to Dean Miller was, I don't actually believe in that anymore. So that's kind of old news. It's the traditional view. So this is sort of what it looks like if you look at the slide. And you've seen other examples of this. It starts in the lab, it meanders into the clinic, eventually somebody will pay attention to it, and 17 years later it may or may not have an impact on health. So that was kind of the traditional view. And I'm going to focus my comments on this box here, because I'm going to make the comment that this is actually one single entity. How it relates to the rest, I'll leave it to those smarter than me, but I'm just going to focus on that single entity, which I think is where science has the biggest impact. So looking at it from a CIHR perspective, for example, there's this whole notion of the pillars. This too, I will argue, is the past. It's not the future. You saw numbers, and I'll give you a similar number, and that is that in these first two pillars, which are the biomedical and the clinical, there's something like 80% of the Alberta academic CIHR-related activity, numbers, dollars, grants, whatever, fits into this area here. But I'm going to make the argument that these are not two separate pillars, this is one pillar. And it's time to think about it as one pillar, and if we do, the opportunities for everything that is discovery-based will have much greater opportunities going forward than ever before, not just because we must, but because we can, both. So, human biology, to me, is incredibly exciting because it is actually now. It's really happening now. I'm actually doing it. I never thought I would say that. I started my PhD working on an invertebrate, and now my laboratory is entirely focused on human biology. And I'll touch on it just for a moment. But the advances are staggering, not just in terms of the breadth, but in terms of the depth of the discoveries that are being made in technological advances, the omics. The ohm is a very favorite word for a lot of people, but there's some reality around what omics is telling us. Stem cell biology, I'm keen on it, but not just because of its therapeutic, more because of its investigative potential in terms of telling you something. And then, of course, the fact that all of this new approach that is done laboratory-based can actually be done at a variety of levels, molecular, cellular, tissues, and systems level. I think the iPS cell discovery, which became the Nobel Prize last year, not this year, but the previous year, is a perfect example of where we're now at the point where there is no reason for anybody to ever study a cultured cell in the laboratory that is not human in nature. The reality is it's now, we can do it, we should be doing it all the time. The flip side is what we can actually do in vivo, which is staggering beyond the image, is also the ability to use bioengineering approaches to non-invasively be able to actually regulate tissue function in a very precise and controlled way. This was impossible up until a few years ago, but that reality is happening now, and I will actually provide cogent examples of how that's happening and how discovery research will actually make it better so that ultimately it will actually be translated into use in the public health system. So, I'm going to argue that we are now actually have to think of all of our science, discovery, whatnot, as integration. So, a friend of mine, Tim Watson, so I knows him well, who's a clinical neurologist in Calgary, coined the following phrase. By the way, I apologize if I don't make the proper attributions at times. I'll do my very best. And his comment was, the whole notion of the academies is our ability to move from the problem-rich environment of the clinic into the solution-rich environment of our laboratories and back. This is what makes it great. This is what he would argue what makes it exciting for a clinician to be there and should make it equally exciting for a scientist to be there. There's no distinction anymore, and we should be populating each other's worlds every day. The question is, how do you actually do that in a meaningful way? It's a lot of talk is cheap. How about on the ground? So I've often had this discussion about it's easy to take, as I would say, the big picture view, but actually how do you put this into action? So I'm going to argue that there is actually a strategy where discovery plays part of a chain, and rather than it being unidirectional, it's actually iterative, and it's something that we are already doing, but we're just not doing it very well. And if we're going to do it well, we're going to have to pick. Because I will make the case that you can't pick. I'm not a physician, but I would argue physicians can't decide who they treat, but researchers can decide what they study. And they should only be studying the things that they are reasonably capable of studying that also intersects where the big needs areas are, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But I think that you have to start small when it comes to working within the ability for our investigators to have small populations of individuals that they can see and they can study that are the clinics that we operate in the centers, large and small. When you have these well-annotated, relatively small groups, there's opportunities to be able to study them both clinically but also in the laboratory. And IPS is one example, tissue analysis, and again, I'll show you some precise examples of how this can be done, to the point where the laboratories are now operating in a human sphere. You can then also adapt the knowledge developed from the clinics and ex vivo to the preclinical models that are highly relevant to the disease states that we're actually interested in. And once again, it's happening. I'll give you a clear model, a clear example of that. And when you take those models and you begin to develop the next generation of diagnostics and therapeutics, whoops, back into the clinic you go, because you have well-annotated populations that you know well, and you can study them longitudinally. This is where we can start. We are starting today, and it's a great opportunity for the future. So I'm going to argue that's an iterative process. The academic health centers are at the core of this process. So what are we going to do in terms of the approach that we have to take? So it starts by defining the problem. And I'm going to argue again that this is going to be done by teams, where within the clinic, the scientists are already in there at the very beginning, working closely with those who are seeing the people. So the academic clinics have the best opportunity to do that. They have well annotated and access to families, patients, and healthy controls. They can collect general and specific health data, and they can also use the academic-driven omics, images, and so on and so forth to develop the next generation of biomarkers. Now, to a lot of the scientists in the room, they'll say, well, yeah, but this is just surveying what's going on, but you have to know, and you have to understand the populations that you're dealing with. And this is not trivial. It actually requires sophisticated research approaches. So the problem can be defined there. More importantly, you can actually develop a hypothesis with that information. Now, the hypothesis is going to require, again, the physician scientists and the biomedical scientists looking at it as if they wanted to understand that problem that has been defined. And they will actually agree on a model. You can actually develop a model for the human, whether it's a normal condition, whether it's how people think, how people process language, versus somebody or a population that are having trouble vocalizing or that are dyslexic. I mean, there is a spectrum of where you can model this, and you can ask the question, where is the gap in the knowledge that we actually have to tackle together? You generate the hypothesis, you come up with the research objectives. As has been done in the very, very simple model organisms for many years, you can adapt the same principles, I believe, to the human condition. And we must do that through hypothesis-generated objectives done collaboratively between the scientists and the physicians. Then comes the real challenge, is how do you actually address those? We have to change the way we do it, because we've always worked with large labs that occasionally try to all have the same technology or related technologies. Can't do that anymore. Technology is too expensive, changes all the time. We need professional scientists to help us drive this. Smaller labs, larger cores, I'm going to come back to examples of these cores that we need, are going to define the way we can tackle these big problems together. You don't need to have your name on the lab anymore. It's not your name that counts. It's actually the program that's going to matter. We also need to have new technologies where we can study human cells, where we can analyze human cells, and where we have the best preclinical models of human physiology and human pathophysiology. And this can only be done by teams, because this is tough stuff to do. But we have to do it because we can do it. And ultimately, we're also going to need the state-of-the-art centers and infrastructure. Advanced imaging, and I'm going to argue again, these types of technologies that allow you to non-invasively regulate at the cellular level is very expensive. We can't be creating them everywhere. We'll have to take a provincial approach. Technologies change all the time. And coupled with that, ultimately, I think, sooner rather than later, is the computational science around it, both understanding, and it's not just when you do neuroscience, which is what I do, but I think everything that we're going to be able to do, human diversity requires that if you're going to study it, you have to have the ability to assimilate, you have to be able to interrogate the information and move huge data sets around. If you don't have the computational power, you'll be extremely limited in your capacity to do so. Develop some of these solutions, which may be medicinal chemistry solutions, maybe techno-therapeutic solutions, and then, of course, you go back to the clinics to test them. And our clinics would be the first place. And I think Sai's right when you say that if we do that, we become attractive for other therapeutics that can be plugged in to this iterative process. But we're going to have to develop a much better way. The SPORE will help us become much more in-depth, well-conceived, and methodologically driven in our clinical trials. A lot of our clinical investigations are not nearly at the level that they need to be to take new approaches in, let alone be attractive for others to test those. Ultimately, there's no question that the spores and the SCNs allow us to then go provincial when you start with a local effort, and that's a huge advantage for us as well that does put us ahead of most other jurisdictions. And if we can get that together, then we can talk about extending it to other provinces and other countries, as was suggested today. So we can do this sort of thing. In many respects, we're already doing it. And I want to give you a couple of examples. And I'm going to work on the premise here that, as I said before, when it comes to doing this kind of research, you can't do it everywhere because health is too big a conundrum for us to be able to cover it in our small jurisdiction. So where are you going to invest that comes to research, in my opinion, you have to prioritize where you actually have a scientific competitive advantage. That would be a critical mass of excellent, proven, and young developing thought leaders that have in their arsenal the technical and methodological expertise, and that this intersects with the greatest areas of unmet health need. But that won't be every area of health. So that's going to be part of the discussion about choosing those areas. That's a discussion, of course, for another day. But what I want to give you two cases in point of how this can be done using some of the things that I talked about. So disclaimer, I work in this area, so I'll show you some data that's actually our data, but I'm also going to argue that we can't do this alone. This is not just a local team. It's not just a Calgary team. It's actually a national team involved in this, and we're part, beginning next year, of a US-Canada team that's targeting adult human brain tumors. So if you get an adult human brain tumor, on average, you're dead in 15 months. This is a serious health issue. The prevalence is not nearly as significant as other things, but if you happen to be one of them, you're asking the question, why isn't science doing something about it? Well, up until about 5 years ago, science wasn't doing a lot about it. There was no change of any significance, but now there is a change. And there's a change for about 3 reasons. The 3 reasons are the following. First, you can now actually image very effectively the brain tumor, and that imaging can dictate to some extent the prognosis, as can omics, in particular genomics, which can actually give you a signature of that tumor. And there's clear differences of genomic signatures and the kind of both current treatment as well as prognosis based on that signature. For some people, that's good news. For some people, it's bad news, because when it's insidious, there is nothing that can be done. But we also have a new model now that we didn't have before, and that is we can phenocopy and genocopy the disease by targeting and developing human brain tumor stem cells. I've been involved in this over the past few years, and now there's an international effort to do this, to actually form collaborations where we deposit all of our lines so everybody in the world will have access to them, because they do actually phenocopy the disease, not just in cell culture, but when xenografted for the first time, an invasive brain tumor can actually be studied in a mouse. And that allows you to then move into experimental therapeutics. And this experimental therapeutics can be anything from medicinal chemistry from our own chemists, as well as that from both small pharma and large pharma that are beating a path now to this national effort that we have in brain tumor experimental therapeutics. Ultimately, we can test them initially in our clinics, as well as clinical trial group collaborations that the National Cancer Institute of Canada has already created for us. And so this is ready to go. It's happening now. Wasn't happening 10 years ago. It's an example of where knowledge can be put into practice and can also attract additional interest from a variety of jurisdictions. It's one example. And all the way along, there's a huge amount of science. There's a huge amount of science of understanding what makes a human brain tumor stem cell different than a normal neural stem cell in humans. This is being studied all the time in parallel with screening for new compounds that will actually kill them in their tracks. One example. Another example, adolescent depression, a case in point. 1 out of 9 teens in this province between the age of 13 and 17 will suffer a major depressive episode. This is actually a huge problem. And if left unchecked, it becomes chronic disease. One could argue for the longest time it's a black box. We don't know what to do. We can't peer into the teenage mind. We can't study this. What are we going to do? Well, actually, we can. So it turns out, here's I'm going to attribute this properly. That image comes from Glenda McQueen's study, which actually showed there's a shrinkage in the hippocampus that may underlie major depressive disorders. Now, that in and of itself doesn't buy you very much unless you can phenocopy that, as has been done now, in stress models in laboratory, which showed high stress during early development can lead to a shrunken hippocampus. Most importantly, showed that it wasn't the numbers of cells, but actually the elaboration of the dendrites. Now, this is hardcore basic science, but also gives you the therapeutic target to look at going forward. Now, we also have technologies such as optogenetics, which allow you to target the structures and the processes that are going on that you have modeled as a consequence of knowing where the effect is, to see if you can stimulate different structures and try to improve the outcome in the animal model. Remarkably, in very short order, you can test that in humans using stimulation technology like transcranial magnetic stimulation. And it's happening. There's actually a pilot study for teens with refractory depression in Calgary right now using RTMS. So it's not a question of will it happen, it's already happening. The point is you need to bring together those groups so that they can dramatically improve the outcome and determine whether this is actually an avenue for therapies going forward. So we might have said you couldn't do it before. The question is, or the answer I think now is, you can do it and you must do it. So, why Alberta? There's always this question of like who do we think we are? We're always the best, we're always the brightest, we're always blah, 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 blah. So, I think there's some truth to that. I would rather focus on, not what the gray hairs like Cy and I would think, but the fact is that this is actually a very young province, remarkably educated, incredibly affluent. And I say to people, think Texas 50 years ago, right? What they did in Texas was they just put holes in the ground and build medical centers because they said, this is what we have to do, and the world will be a path to our door. So I can tell you, our biggest collaboration brain tumor now is with MD Anderson in Houston because they do, and they don't just talk about it, they go hard. There's no reason why we can't be like them, be as good, if not better. And I think that our community actually really subscribes to the importance of the academic health centers. They don't see it as just a good place to go and get taken care of. They want it to be the place where they believe the cutting edge, state of the art is going on because we have the capacity to do it. And so they're thirsting for that. They also want to understand it. So I think it's very important as part of the future strategy is engaging the community in knowledge-based impact on their care in the longer term. So I really believe ultimately the championing integrated human health science, some of the examples I've showed you, is truly today. It's not tomorrow. It'll be a question of choices, of the areas we pursue, and also determining if we have the capacity to develop both the human and physical infrastructure to tackle it. And I would say, and it was not prompted by AIHS, AIHS is not going to be the solution for all of that because, as we all know, this level of technology will require remarkable partnerships from all of the people or all the organizations we've heard about before. We need to have, I believe, AIHS help us catalyze those opportunities. So, we already have remarkable assets, there's no question. We built those up over the last 20 years. I was here when the Alberta Heritage Foundation was born. I've seen it. I've seen the talent cadre, which I think is fantastic. And I think there's some really clear examples that everybody would say, science leads to better care. Cardiac science leads to better cardiology, inflammation immunology, better internal medicine, better neuroscience, better neurology. Everybody understands that. And that's not something we have to pretend about. Our dean, John Meddings, I hear him telling people this all the time. If you want to understand what we're doing, it's more than training more physicians. We're actually developing knowledge that's going to impact on your life. And it's true. We are doing that. And we've had a lot of great buildings built. Hospitals, innovation centers. I mean, they're huge. I don't think we need any more buildings. I hope that's okay for me to say that. We've also had a lot of new opportunities to recruit senior leaders, CAPES and AIHS translational chairs. And the team grants are having an impact. One can argue where are they going, as Cy would suggest, that this can all be refined, but we are supporting the teams. And it is a team effort for sure. I think as I outlined in my examples, you can't do this stuff on your own. Parenthetically, you can still go back and inquire on something more granular that you are interested in, but the context that you can operate in today is absolutely amazing. I don't believe there's another jurisdiction that can do that. What's missing? There's always something missing, right? So I'm going to argue that the clinician scientist, which I worry all the time, is imperiled by the just the landscape that we operate in. And I'm not going to editorialize about the perils. But we need these folks, in particular those who can help us develop the human models and have in-depth clinical trial capacity. Because you develop the model and you come all the way back, and if they don't understand how to run a meaningful clinical trial, we're in deep trouble. So we need that, and that's capacity that can either be built from internally or needs to be recruited. I think we need a cadre of professional scientists, more of these sorts of people who don't write grants, who don't have to report to department heads, sorry to the department heads, but are actually going to help us ensure that we have the state-of-the-art technology. Because without those people helping us develop those technologies, the investigators are spending too much time trying to build, sort of in the garage, the technology they need to be successful. So you need the people to help you adapt the best technologies for the science going forward. And then I'll come back to the computational. I truly believe that, BlackBerry's going to have a lot of people looking for jobs. I mean, that's my guess. Maybe some of these people can be convinced to come to Alberta and join what we do, because they just need to help us be able to inquire. I think a lot of us know the kinds of questions we want to ask. Having the capacity, access to the data is another story, but at least to be able to inquire is going to require a cadre of these kinds of folks. Majority of which I would still argue will be the non-GFT types, although we can probably use some more strength, bench strength in computer scientists. The infrastructure, again, changes rapidly and it's very expensive. We have to take a provincial view on the kinds of infrastructure when it comes to imaging, of which the modalities are changing, increasing all the time. We've got some, but there's more that, I don't know any combined PET MR, for example, in the province. Not having it puts it at a huge disadvantage compared to other jurisdictions. The multimodal stimulation ablation technologies, which are coming on board every day, we are beginning to tackle these, but we're going to need more of it because it has both research and therapeutic advantages. I really believe in human IPS. I think we need to have a provincial facility for human IPS. And we need the kinds of state-of-the-art investigative technologies that are the animal-based mouse, transgenic, optogenetic, and the biophotonic microscopy that allows us to peer into the awake, conscious animal that is our preclinical model. And once again, of course, the computational bioinformatics, and as you've heard it probably too many times. So this is for Cy, right? So this is when he's in his office thinking about his clinical, and he's coined a new phrase, generate business, so on and so forth. But what I'm going to say is that I don't think the science community is here to ask for, yeah, we need a break, like throw us something so that no. We want to actually, I think, because we already got talent, we want to actually be part of something more meaningful. And I think that's what's on the table. And I think AIHS can help us chart the future. It's not going to replace anything that we think is lacking, but it's going to help us chart that future. It's going to be absolutely essential. And I just want to leave you with a thought from one of the people that I admire the most, and that is the late Premier Lougheed. Okay, and this is his park. That's not a painting, that's actually a photograph of Three Isle Lake, and I was there this summer. And he said, my whole life, 365 days a year, was team sports. And I found anything in my public life we really accomplished that was worthwhile, we accomplished as a team. So I believe in Team Alberta. It's the best place in the world to live. We are going to make a difference, and I'm excited about the future. Thanks for your attention.